I never thought the worst moment of my life would begin with laughter. Not screaming, not anger, but soft, careless laughter echoing behind me as cold metal closed around my wrists. Ha ha ha, yes, laughter. The kind that tells you the people watching don't see you as human anymore, just a problem they finally solved. And as I stood there confused, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs, I realized the laughter belonged to my own son and the woman he married, the two faces I had trusted more than anyone else on this earth. And in that moment, before the cuffs even tightened, before anyone read any charges, I knew something was deeply wrong, because innocent people panic, they beg, they ask questions, but guilty plans smile. And my son was smiling like a man who had just won a prize he'd been waiting for a long time to collect. Sai, the officer, didn't look at me when he turned me around, didn't explain much either, just muttered words like procedure and holding, and suddenly my feet were moving without my permission. Guided down a hallway that smelled like bleach and old regret, while behind me I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and playful, saying, "Enjoy prison, Mom," and my son adding, almost jokingly, "Don't worry. We'll take care of everything you own." And that's when it hit me, not the handcuffs, not the concrete floor, but the meaning behind those words, because they weren't angry, they weren't emotional, they were calm, confident. As if all of this had already been decided long before today, I tried to turn around, tried to catch my son's eye, to search his face for doubt, guilt, anything familiar, but he wouldn't look at me, just laughed again, a short laugh. Like someone closing a chapter they're done reading, and my chest tightened so badly I had to swallow hard just to breathe, because this was the same child whose fever I used to check every hour at night. The same hands I once held while crossing busy streets, and now those same hands were clapping quietly as I was dragged away like a stranger, weeping inside but refusing to let it spill out, not yet, not in front of them. Because something deep inside me refused to give them that satisfaction. The holding area came faster than my thoughts could keep up. 1 minute I was under bright lights with voices bouncing off tiled walls. The next I was being pushed into a small concrete space that felt colder than winter, the door slamming shut behind me with a sound so final it echoed inside my bones, and as the lock clicked, my daughter-in-law's heels stopped. She leaned close to the bars, close enough that I could smell her perfume, expensive, familiar, bought with money she never earned, and she whispered, "You should have just signed everything quietly." Before straightening up and walking away like this was just another errand crossed off her list. Ha ha ha, imagine that, your life collapsing while someone else is already thinking about lunch plans, and as their footsteps faded, silence rushed in, heavy and loud at the same time, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of doors opening and closing for other people whose stories I didn't know, but whose faces all seemed to carry the same empty look, the look of someone who didn't expect to end up here. I sat down slowly on the cold bench, joints aching, hands shaking despite my effort to stay calm. And that's when the fear finally started creeping in, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet one that asks dangerous questions like, what if they're right, and what if no one ever listens to you again, and what if this is how it ends? Sigh, because at my age, time doesn't feel endless anymore, every year matters, every day matters. And the thought of losing them all behind locked doors over lies I didn't even understand made my stomach twist. Yet even through that fear, one thing kept scratching at my mind, something that didn't fit, something that felt off. Because my son and his wife weren't acting like people taking revenge, they were acting like people executing a plan, and the more I replayed their words in my head, the clearer it became, this wasn't about punishment. This was about timing, about removing me from the picture long enough for something else to happen. I looked down at my hands then, still cuffed, still trembling, and noticed how ridiculous it was that something so small could cause such a big collapse, a signature here, a paper there, trust given freely because it was family, off family. The word felt heavy now, like something cracked and hollow. And as I sat there listening to my own breathing, I wondered how long they had been waiting for this day, how many dinners, smiles, and polite conversations had been rehearsals for this moment, and the thought made my throat burn. Because betrayal hurts differently when it wears a familiar face, it doesn't explode, it sinks in slowly, poisoning everything it touches. A guard walked past my cell then, glanced at me briefly and kept walking, nothing unusual. Just another woman locked up, another story he wouldn't remember by the end of his shift, and I told myself that's all I was now, another file, another number, another inconvenience moved out of the way, and for a few seconds, I almost believed it, almost let the hopelessness win, but then a strange calm settled in, not confidence, not relief, just clarity, because if they were this sure, this relaxed, this celebratory, it meant they believed I had no way back, no leverage, no protection, and people only laugh like that when they think they've already taken everything from you. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes for a moment, and let out a slow breath, trying to steady the storm inside my chest, because somewhere beyond this cell, my son was already counting money that wasn't his yet, already planning changes to a house he didn't build. already imagining a future where I was nothing more than an inconvenience he successfully erased, and that realization hurt more than the handcuffs ever could, weeping quietly without tears. Because crying felt too loud for the kind of damage this was, and as I opened my eyes again and stared at the gray walls around me, one thought kept looping in my mind, sharp and unsettling, the kind you can't ignore once it forms. If they went this far to lock me away, what exactly were they so desperate to take, and why were they so certain no one would stop them? The holding cell didn't feel real at first, like my mind refused to accept that my body was actually there, sitting on a bench so cold it seeped straight into my bones, the concrete pressing against my back. The air thick with a sour mix of metal, sweat, and something old that never quite leaves places like this, and I remember thinking, this is where stories end, this is where people disappear quietly. And that thought alone made my chest tighten so badly I had to lean forward just to breathe, because the silence wasn't peaceful, it was watching me. Broken only by distant voices and the occasional clang of doors that sounded like punctuation marks in other people's ruined sentences. Ha ha ha, imagine laughing at yourself in a place like that just to stay sane. Because crying felt too dangerous, like once I started I might never stop. Across the narrow space, someone else sat with their head down, I didn't know their name, didn't want to. But the way their shoulders slumped told me they had already given up, and that scared me more than the locked door, because I couldn't afford to give up, not yet, not when everything about this felt unfinished, unresolved. Like a story missing a crucial page, and as I stared at the floor, tracing cracks with my eyes, my thoughts drifted back to my son's face, that smile, that easy laugh, and the more I replayed it, the more it felt wrong. Because it wasn't cruel in the way anger is cruel, it was efficient, tidy, like he'd already practiced it in his head. Sigh, how many times had he imagined me sitting here while he stood free? Time moved strangely in that cell. Stretching and shrinking without warning, minutes feeling like hours, hours dissolving into nothing, and my hands ached where the cuffs had been. A dull reminder that this wasn't a bad dream I could wake up from. And I kept telling myself to focus on something solid, something real, like the feel of my breath going in and out, or the faint hum of electricity overhead, but my mind refused to cooperate. Instead, pulling me into memories I wasn't ready to face, memories of signing papers I didn't fully read because I trusted the person handing them to me, memories of being told, it's just a formality. And nodding because that's what mothers do when their children say everything is under control. A guard walked by again, slower this time, his boots echoing softly, and he glanced in my direction, just for a second longer than before. Not suspicious, not curious, just observant, like he was filing away details without realizing it, and for some reason that made my stomach flutter with something I couldn't name, maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe nothing at all. And I looked down at my hands again, at the thin skin, the faint veins, the small marks of age that told the story of a life lived carefully, quietly, responsibly, and I thought, how did all of that lead me here? How did a lifetime of doing the right thing end with me waiting behind bars while my own child celebrated outside? I tried to remember exactly when things shifted, when conversations turned from visits into meetings, when questions about my health quietly became questions about my accounts, when concerns slowly transformed into curiosity, and curiosity into entitlement, and as those thoughts piled up, I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. Awe not from the smell or the cold, but from the realization that I had ignored so many small warning signs because admitting them would have meant admitting something unbearable, that the person I loved most was capable of doing this. And I wondered how many parents sit in places like this replaying the same regrets, the same missed moments when they could have said no, could have asked questions, could have protected themselves instead of their children. Someone coughed nearby, sharp and dry, pulling me back to the present, and I noticed how the light in the cell never changed, always the same dull brightness that erased any sense of time, making it impossible to tell if it was morning or night. And that unsettled me deeply, because without time there's no progress, no countdown, just waiting, and as I waited my thoughts kept circling one detail that refused to stay quiet, something small, almost silly compared to everything else. The ring on my finger, sigh, it wasn't flashy, wasn't expensive looking, and yet I found myself touching it unconsciously, rubbing my thumb over its surface like I had done 1,000 times before during moments of stress. And I almost laughed at myself for it, ha ha ha, clinging to jewelry in a jail cell, how pathetic. But the truth was, that ring had been with me through moments far worse than this, through loss, through loneliness, through decisions that changed the direction of my life, and somehow, sitting there, it felt heavier than usual, like it was reminding me of something I wasn't ready to remember. Yet a door opened somewhere down the hall, voices rose briefly, then faded, and my heart jumped at every sound, each one carrying the possibility of bad news, of being moved, of being forgotten, and I realized then how fragile a person becomes once they're locked in. How quickly confidence drains away when control is stripped from you piece by piece, weeping silently now, tears finally blurring my vision as I pressed my lips together to keep from making a sound. Because there's a special kind of shame that comes with crying in a place where no one is supposed to care, and I refused to let that be my last act of dignity. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and straightened my shoulders, forcing myself to sit upright, to look like someone who still belonged to herself, even if everything else had been taken. And as I did, I noticed that same guard again, standing a little farther away this time, not close enough to speak, but close enough that I could feel his presence, and our eyes met briefly, just a flicker, but there was something there, something unreadable, and he didn't look away immediately like the others had, which sent a strange shiver down my spine. Because in places like this, attention is rarely neutral, it either means trouble or change. I broke the eye contact first, staring back down at the floor, my heart beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from that quiet instinct that tells you something is about to shift. And I thought about my son again, about how confident he'd been, how sure that once the door closed behind me, nothing could touch him. And a question rose up uninvited, sharp and persistent, one that made my fingers curl slightly against the cold bench. What if he was wrong? What if there was something he hadn't noticed, something so small he dismissed it as meaningless, something resting quietly in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to see it? And as footsteps approached my cell once more, slower, deliberate, stopping just outside the bars, I lifted my head, my breath catching, because suddenly the silence felt different, heavier, charged like the air right before a storm. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would decide whether I stayed invisible forever, or whether everything my son thought he had stolen was about to slip straight through his fingers. Sitting there with nothing but my thoughts and the faint echo of footsteps beyond the bars, my mind finally began to do the one thing I had been avoiding since the cuffs snapped shut. It started connecting the pieces, slow and painful, like pulling thorns out of skin one by one, and suddenly moments from the past few months replayed themselves with a clarity that made my stomach drop. Sigh, because what I had brushed off as concern, what I had excused as stress, what I had forgiven as impatience, now looked disturbingly deliberate, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this didn't start today. It started long before anyone dragged me into a cell. It started with questions. Innocent at first, almost sweet, my son asking if I was tired of managing everything alone, if paperwork stressed me out, if it wouldn't be easier if he helped. Ha ha ha, help, that word tastes bitter now. Because help slowly turned into suggestions, suggestions into expectations, and expectations into quiet pressure wrapped in smiles and reassurances, and every time I hesitated, every time I said I wanted to think about it, his wife would step in with that soft voice, the one designed to sound caring while steering you exactly where she wanted, saying things like, "You've done enough, it's our turn now," and I believed them not because the words were convincing, but because the faces were familiar, because love makes liars sound reasonable. I remembered the first document they brought, folded neatly, already marked with sticky notes where they wanted my signature. Nothing urgent, they said. Just an update, just something to make things smoother in case of emergencies. And I remember laughing lightly, saying, "You make it sound like I'm going somewhere," and my son laughing back a little too quickly, saying, "You never know, Mom." Oh, how strange that sentence feels now, because sitting in that cell, it sounded less like a joke and more like a warning I didn't hear in time. Each visit after that followed the same pattern: warm greetings, casual talk. Then paperwork sliding across the table, always when I was tired, always after they'd stayed just long enough for me to relax, and I'd sign because arguing felt exhausting, because I trusted the hands that passed me the pen, because saying no felt like accusing my own child of something unthinkable, and now, trapped behind metal bars, I realized how carefully they'd timed it all. How they waited until my defenses were worn down by age and routine and loneliness. Weeping softly at the memory of how easily I handed over pieces of my life one signature at a time, the holding cell seemed to shrink as these realizations piled up, the walls closing in not from fear, but from understanding. Because this wasn't a sudden betrayal born out of desperation, it was structured, paced, rehearsed, and the confidence in their laughter earlier suddenly made sense. They weren't celebrating my arrest. They were celebrating the final step of a process already completed, and that thought made my hands tremble again, because if they were this sure, it meant they believed every legal door was closed to me, every objection neutralized, every escape blocked before I even knew I needed one. I pressed my back against the wall and exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay present because panic wouldn't help now. And I started examining the plan as if it belonged to someone else, coldly, logically, like how my son must have done. Step 1, gain access. Step 2, create dependency. Step 3, isolate. Step 4, remove. And that final step, the one I was living through right now, involved locking me away long enough for them to act freely, without questions, without resistance, without witnesses. Ha ha ha. It was terrifying how simple it looked once laid bare. The anger came next. Sharp and sudden, replacing fear with something hotter, something steadier, because what hurt wasn't just the loss of property or freedom, it was the realization that my own child had studied my weaknesses, had learned exactly which strings to pull, and had used my love as a tool against me. And that kind of betrayal doesn't scream, it sinks deep, settling into your chest like a weight you don't know how to carry. I felt foolish, exposed. Like my entire life had been quietly evaluated and exploited by the one person who was supposed to protect me when I could no longer protect myself. A laugh echoed from somewhere down the corridor, then, distant, muffled. Probably unrelated, but it sent a jolt through me anyway because it sounded too much like my son's laughter earlier, and I clenched my jaw, refusing to let tears take over again. Reminding myself that understanding the plan meant understanding its flaws too, and no plan is perfect, no matter how confident the people behind it appear. There's always something overlooked, something dismissed as insignificant, something they assume will never matter. And as that thought settled in, my gaze drifted back to my hands, to the small, familiar weight resting there, the thing I had barely thought about until now. I turned my hand slightly, letting the dull light catch the surface of the ring, and I almost smiled at the irony. Ha ha ha, how absurd that something so unremarkable could feel suddenly important, and I shook my head at myself, dismissing the thought. Because surely this wasn't the time for superstition or sentimentality, and yet deep down, a quiet certainty began to grow, subtle but persistent, that my son's plan, as thorough as it was, had one blind spot. One detail he never bothered to question, because to him it meant nothing at all. And as footsteps approached again, stopping closer this time, slow and measured, I lifted my head, my heart thudding softly, realizing that the next move wouldn't be made by me or my son, but by someone who had just started to notice the very thing he ignored. And whatever happened next would decide whether this plan stayed airtight, or whether it would begin to unravel in ways none of them were prepared for. The ring hadn't crossed my mind as anything more than habit until that moment, until the silence in the holding cell grew so thick it pressed against my ears, and I found myself turning my hand slowly, watching how the dull overhead light slid across its surface, and I almost laughed under my breath, ha ha ha, because of all the things to focus on in a place like this. A ring seemed ridiculous, childish even. Yet my fingers kept drifting back to it, tracing the smooth edge the way they always did when my nerves were stretched thin. Sigh, some habits don't disappear just because your world collapses. And as I studied it more closely, memories I had pushed far away began creeping back, uninvited but persistent, carrying a weight I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of ring that draws attention or sparks envy, no large stone, no glitter. Just a simple band with markings so faint most people never notice them. And that was exactly why I wore it openly, why I never took it off, because to anyone else it was nothing, just another old woman's jewelry. Sentimental at best, forgettable at worst. But sentiment has a way of anchoring us to moments we survive, and that ring had been with me through times far darker than this cell, times when I thought my life was already over. When loneliness felt permanent and silence filled every corner of my home, I remembered the day I first slipped it onto my finger, not during celebration, not surrounded by people, but in a quiet room where voices were low and promises were made carefully, the kind of promises that don't need witnesses because they carry their own weight. And I remembered thinking then that it wasn't about what the ring symbolized to the world, but what it represented to the people who understood it. Ha ha ha, funny how you forget those details when life moves on, when routine dulls meaning. And you start believing the hardest chapters are behind you. A faint shuffle outside the cell pulled me back to the present, and I noticed that the guard who had lingered earlier was closer now, standing just beyond the bars, pretending to check something on a clipboard while his eyes flicked toward my hands again, and my pulse quickened slightly, not from fear but from curiosity, because this was the third time he'd looked. And people don't look at nothing 3 times, especially not in places where boredom is routine, and I instinctively curled my fingers inward, then stopped myself, forcing my hand to rest naturally, because whatever this was, hiding it felt wrong, like disrupting a thread that was already being pulled. The guard didn't speak, didn't approach, but his presence lingered, heavy and deliberate, and I could feel the shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The way you can sense a storm before the first drop falls, and as he finally walked away, slower than before, my thoughts raced, trying to understand why a simple ring would draw attention from someone who had probably seen thousands of prisoners pass through these halls. Sigh, maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was grasping at hope because hope was easier than accepting defeat, but something deep in my chest refused to let the thought go. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes briefly, letting the memory return fully now, the memory of being told, wear it openly, don't hide it, and me laughing then too, saying, who would ever care? And the reply, common cert, the right people will. That sentence echoed in my mind with a clarity that made my throat tighten, because sitting here, stripped of control and dignity, that promise suddenly felt very close, very real. And very dangerous for the people who thought they had already won. My son had never asked about the ring, never commented on it, never questioned its meaning, and that omission struck me now like a sharp realization. Because he asked about everything else, every document, every account, every detail that could be measured or sold, but not that, and maybe that was because it didn't look valuable, because it didn't fit into spreadsheets or contracts. And that blind spot, that single overlooked detail, felt suddenly enormous, like a crack running through the foundation of his perfect Plan A. Sound broke the silence then, a voice calm but firm, speaking to someone just out of sight. And I recognized it not from familiarity but from authority, the kind that doesn't raise itself unnecessarily, the kind that expects to be obeyed without explanation, and my heart skipped as footsteps followed, heavier than the others. More deliberate, stopping directly in front of my cell, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a man standing there whose posture alone told me he wasn't just another guard passing time. His gaze moved slowly, professionally, taking in my face, my posture, the way I held myself, and then, inevitably, his eyes dropped to my hands and lingered, not casually, not out of boredom, but with focus, with recognition, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not victory, but awareness, because whatever he saw, whatever connection sparked behind his eyes wasn't accidental, and as he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear, I felt my breath catch. Realizing that my son's plan, built on arrogance and certainty, had just collided with a detail he never bothered to question, and whatever those markings on my ring meant to this man. They meant enough to stop him in his tracks, and as he leaned in slightly, studying it one more time, I knew with chilling certainty that this was the moment everything began to change. The man didn't speak right away, and that silence was somehow louder than the clanging doors or distant voices, because silence from someone like him isn't emptiness, it's calculation. And I could feel it settling over the space between us as he straightened slowly, eyes still fixed on my hand, on that small, unremarkable ring my son never once cared to ask about. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating, not with fear exactly, but with that strange instinct that tells you something irreversible has just been set in motion. Something that won't be stopped simply because people wish it would. He finally looked up at my face, really looked, not the way guards glance at inmates, but the way someone evaluates truth, weighing it carefully before deciding what to do with it, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly, the lines around his eyes tightening, his jaw setting as if a thought had clicked into place. I had seen that look before in men who carried responsibility like armor, men who didn't rush, men who understood consequences, and suddenly the holding cell felt smaller, not because I was trapped, but because power had quietly stepped inside it. "Stand up," he said softly, and the softness startled me more than a shout would have, because authority doesn't need volume to be obeyed, and my legs trembled as I rose, unsure if this was leading to another humiliation or something far worse. And as I did, he stepped closer, just enough to confirm what he had already seen, his eyes tracing the faint markings on the ring with careful attention. Imagine that, my entire fate hanging on whether a stranger noticed a detail no one else bothered to see. He exhaled slowly through his nose, then glanced down the corridor, checking who might be watching. Before leaning in just slightly, his voice dropping even lower, "How long have you had that?" And the question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how it was asked, not accusatory, not curious, but respectful, like one adult quietly confirming a fact with another, and I answered honestly, my voice barely above a whisper, "A long time," and something flickered across his face then. Something like recognition mixed with disbelief. He straightened again and took a step back, creating distance where moments ago there had been tension, and that alone told me everything had shifted. Because people who plan to hurt you don't step back, they lean in, and I watched as he nodded once to himself, as if confirming an internal decision, before turning slightly and motioning for another guard to come closer. And when he spoke to him, his tone had changed completely. No urgency, no explanation, just instruction, the kind that doesn't invite questions. And as the other guard hurried off, I stood there frozen, my mind racing, trying to understand how a single glance at my hand had rewritten the rules of the room. The man turned back to me then, and for the first time since this nightmare began, someone in authority addressed me not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as a person. "Sit down," he said gently, and I obeyed, my knees weak, my palms damp, my thoughts tangled in confusion. And as I sat, he remained standing just outside the bars, arms folded, watching the corridor instead of me now, like someone guarding something valuable rather than containing something dangerous. And that realization sent a shiver through me, because minutes ago I was invisible. And now I was being protected. He didn't explain himself, didn't offer comfort, didn't ask questions about my case, and strangely that restraint felt reassuring. Because men who talk too much in places like this often don't intend to help, but men who act quietly usually do, and as time passed, I noticed how other guards deferred to him, lowering their voices when they spoke. Changing direction when he moved, Psy authority again, unmistakable, undeniable, and my son, wherever he was right now, had no idea this was happening. No idea that the certainty he'd laughed with earlier was already beginning to crumble. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, the man looked back at me, his expression steady, unreadable, and said words I hadn't expected to hear, not today. No one is touching you tonight, and my breath caught sharply, because those words weren't a promise, they were a statement of fact, and before I could ask what he meant, he added, quieter still, and you're not going anywhere until I make a call, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt since the cell door slammed shut, not relief, not safety, but balance. Like the ground beneath me had stopped shifting for the first time all day. He turned and walked away then, his footsteps calm, unhurried, leaving me alone again with the cold bench and the humming lights, but the silence felt different now. Charged, expectant, and I stared down at my hands once more, at the ring that had suddenly become far heavier than metal, my fingers trembling as I realized the full weight of what had just happened, because whatever that man knew, whatever that ring represented to him, it was powerful enough to interrupt a system designed to swallow people whole, and as I leaned back against the wall, my heart pounding softly with cautious hope, one thought repeated itself over and over. Louder than fear, louder than doubt. My son thought he had removed every obstacle, but he never once thought to ask who I truly belonged to, or who might come looking once the right person finally noticed. Time moved differently after that, not slower, not faster, just heavier, as if every second now carried meaning it hadn't before, and I sat there listening to the hum of the lights and the distant shuffle of boots, feeling something unfamiliar settle into my chest, not comfort exactly, but steadiness, like a boat that had finally stopped drifting even though the storm was still raging all around it. My hands rested quietly in my lap now, no longer shaking, the ring cool against my skin, and I realized how strange it was that only minutes ago I had felt completely erased, and now, without a single promise or explanation, I felt noticed. The man returned. Not alone this time, and the guards around him moved differently, more alert, more careful, like the air itself had been instructed to behave, and though no one said my name, no one needed to, because attention had shifted. Subtle but unmistakable, and I became aware of how systems respond when something unexpected enters their order, how routines bend, how procedures pause. It was almost ironic. Watching the same place that had swallowed me whole begin to hesitate, as if unsure how to proceed, I thought of my son then, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of tired clarity. Because he had built his plan on assumptions about age, about weakness, about isolation, and above all, about silence, and he believed silence meant safety, that once I was locked away, the world would move on without questioning the story he sold so easily, and I wondered how many people sit quietly in places like this because they assume no one will ever look closely enough to see the truth. How many stories end simply because they're never examined. As I waited, my thoughts drifted outward, away from the cell, away from concrete and metal, toward the idea of being heard, of someone somewhere, caring enough to pause and ask why. And I realized something important then, something I wish I had understood earlier in life, that silence can protect lies just as easily as it protects peace, and sometimes, staying quiet for too long teaches people the wrong lesson. That you will always endure whatever they decide to put you through, weeping softly at the realization that my patience had been mistaken for permission. If you've ever felt that way, ever swallowed your words to keep the peace, ever trusted someone simply because they shared your blood, then you know how dangerous that quiet can become, and maybe that's why stories like this matter, because they remind us that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a detail someone else ignored, and if hearing that resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated, then stay with me, and if you don't want to miss stories where patience turns into power, maybe subscribe, not for entertainment, but as a reminder that endings aren't always what they seem. A phone rang somewhere nearby, sharp and sudden, slicing through my thoughts, and I watched as one of the guards stiffened slightly before answering, his tone respectful, almost cautious, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could see the change in posture, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his eyes flicked toward me before quickly looking away, and my heart began to beat faster again, not from fear this time, but anticipation, because calls like that don't happen without consequence. And whatever name had just been spoken on the other end carried weight. The man returned once more, his expression unchanged, calm, controlled, but there was something new behind his eyes now, something resolved, and he stopped in front of my cell, resting one hand lightly on the bars, not gripping them, not leaning, just present, and he spoke quietly. "You're going to stay right here," as if there had ever been another option, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added, Someone important has been informed, and my breath caught at the word important because importance in places like this doesn't announce itself. It arrives in silence and moves quickly around us. The rhythm of the place shifted again. Guards passing messages under their breath, doors opening and closing with more purpose than before, and I felt as though I were sitting at the still center of a wheel that had suddenly begun to spin faster. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself a fragile, careful thought, not hope, not victory, just possibility, because somewhere beyond these walls, something had been set in motion that my son hadn't planned for. Something he couldn't laugh off or sign away. I closed my eyes briefly and let out a slow breath, steadying myself because whatever came next would matter, not just for me, but for everything he believed was already his. And as footsteps echoed again, heavier, more numerous this time, I understood that the quiet confidence my son wore earlier was about to meet something far less forgiving than patience. And as I opened my eyes and looked once more at the ring that had gone unnoticed for so long, one truth settled firmly in my chest, calm and unshakable. This place was no longer just holding me, it was holding the moment his certainty would finally break. While I waited inside those walls, unaware of how loud the silence outside had become, my son was already celebrating, ha, not quietly, not cautiously, but with the kind of careless confidence that only comes when someone believes the game is finished, when they think the final move has already been played, and somewhere not far from where I sat on that cold bench. He and his wife were laughing over drinks, talking about next steps, about paperwork, about listings and timelines, about how quickly things could move now that I was out of the way. And just imagining that made my chest ache in a way I didn't know how to explain, because betrayal hurts most when it wears a smile. I could almost see it without being there, the way my son would lean back in his chair, relaxed, proud, telling his wife that everything went perfectly, that the officers didn't ask questions, that I looked small and confused when they took me away, sigh, and she would laugh, pleased, already picturing herself walking through rooms she never earned, touching furniture she never paid for, changing locks, changing stories, changing the past as if it were something disposable, and what terrified me wasn't just the theft, but how easily they justified it. How quickly they turned me into a problem they solved instead of a person they loved. Inside the holding area, I felt the contrast sharply, because while they were clinking glasses, guards were whispering while they were planning renovations. Phones were ringing, and while they were congratulating themselves, names were being spoken quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, and that difference, that split between what they believed and what was actually unfolding, felt almost surreal. Like two stories running at once, one loud and arrogant, the other silent and decisive, and I was sitting at the center of it without moving an inch. A guard passed by my cell again, quicker this time, not even pretending to glance inside. And another followed and another, and I noticed how none of them spoke casually anymore, how the easy boredom had drained from their movements, replaced by something sharper, more alert, and my breath slowed as I realized this wasn't normal. This wasn't routine. Places like this thrive on routine, and the moment routine breaks, something important is happening, something someone very much wants to control. I thought of my son's voice again, the way he'd said, "Everything you own is ours," like it was already a done deal, like the world had stamped approval on his greed, and I wondered what he would sound like now if he knew that assumption was being quietly questioned. If he knew that behind the scenes, the story he'd told so confidently was being examined piece by piece, not with emotion but with authority, because authority doesn't argue, it verifies. And that realization made my fingers curl slightly in my lap, not in triumph, but in restraint, because whatever was coming, I needed to meet it with the same calm that had carried me through worse losses than money or walls. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed with purpose, not the careless slam of earlier, but a controlled movement. Followed by voices I couldn't quite make out, low and serious, and I leaned my head back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange tension of knowing something was unfolding while being unable to see it, weeping softly now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding that my son's confidence was built on a fragile foundation. One crack, one overlooked detail, one phone call, and the entire structure could collapse. I wondered how long he'd been waiting for this moment, how many times he'd imagined himself free of responsibility, free of questions, free of me, and that thought hurt more than anything else. Because money can be replaced, dignity can be restored, but realizing that someone you raised was capable of celebrating your downfall is a wound that doesn't close easily. It lingers, reshaping how you remember everything that came before. The footsteps outside my cell grew more frequent now, overlapping, intersecting, and I noticed how guards stopped using first names, how instructions were passed carefully, how even the air seemed to hold its breath, and that's when it truly sank in. My son believed the door had closed behind me forever, but in reality it was closing on him, slowly, quietly, without warning. And the irony of that almost made me smile, not with joy, not with revenge, but with a sober acceptance that truth doesn't need to announce itself to win. As I sat there, steady, waiting, I imagined him raising his glass, laughing one last time, unaware that the story he thought was finished was still being written, unaware that while he celebrated certainty, uncertainty was moving toward him with deliberate steps. And as the sound of synchronized boots echoed somewhere beyond the corridor, heavier than before, unmistakable in their purpose, I lowered my gaze, exhaled softly, and understood something with absolute clarity. The moment my son believed he had everything under control was the exact moment control slipped out of his hands, and he wouldn't even realize it until it was far too late. The reveal didn't arrive with shouting or chaos, it arrived the way real power always does, quietly, efficiently, without needing permission. And I realized that the moment the man returned, not alone this time, his steps slower, more deliberate, his presence heavier than before, and when he stopped in front of my cell again, there was no doubt left in his eyes, no curiosity, no testing, just certainty. Sigh, the kind that tells you a decision has already been made somewhere far above this place, somewhere my son never imagined his name would reach. He unlocked the small door in front of the bars, not to let me out, but to step closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves didn't deserve to hear what he was about to say, and when he spoke, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't threatening, it was calm to the point of being terrifying. "That ring you're wearing," he said, pausing just long enough for my breath to catch, "it doesn't belong in a holding cell," and something in my chest cracked open at those words, not relief yet, not victory, but recognition, because for the first time since this nightmare began, someone wasn't questioning my innocence, they were acknowledging my identity. He straightened and gestured slightly with his hand, and another man stepped forward, older, sharper, his posture unmistakably authoritative, and when their eyes met, there was no introduction needed, no exchange of names, just a brief nod between people who understood hierarchy without explanation. I had seen that nod before in places where decisions weren't debated, they were enforced. And the older man's gaze followed the same path as the others, from my face to my hand, resting there longer than anyone else's had, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Do you know what that symbol means?" I shook my head slowly, even though a part of me already knew, or at least felt it, deep in my bones, and he nodded as if expecting that answer, explaining quietly, "It's not about money," he said. "And it's not about status." Then he looked back at the first man and added, "It's about authority that doesn't announce itself," and with that, everything clicked, not all at once, but enough to make my hands tremble. Because my son had been obsessed with things he could count, documents he could file, property he could sell, and he had missed the one thing that couldn't be transferred or stolen. Ha, the one thing that doesn't show up on paper. The older man turned slightly, speaking to someone just out of sight, his tone firm but controlled, and within seconds the atmosphere shifted again, heavier, more focused, like a storm finally choosing its direction, and I watched as guards adjusted their stance, as radios crackled softly, as names were repeated carefully, and it dawned on me then, fully, that this wasn't about saving me from a cell. It was about correcting a mistake that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. He looked back at me, his expression softening just enough to feel human, and said words I'll never forget, "You were never supposed to be here." And I felt the weight of the last hours crash over me all at once. The fear, the humiliation, the betrayal, all breaking free in a quiet rush of tears I could no longer hold back, weeping openly now, not from weakness but from release. Because there's something profoundly healing about being told the truth when the world has tried so hard to convince you of a lie. He didn't rush me, didn't interrupt, just waited until I steadied my breathing, and then continued. "Your son made assumptions, and that sentence alone carried more weight than any accusation, because assumptions are fragile things, easily shattered by facts, and the fact he was about to unleash would travel fast, far beyond this building. Far beyond the laughter that had followed me into custody earlier. I could almost feel the ripple beginning, spreading outward, touching phones, offices, desks, people who didn't laugh easily or forgive carelessness." The first man stepped back then, speaking quietly into his radio, confirming instructions, and I caught fragments of phrases that told me enough. Hold, no transfer, stand by, and my heart pounded softly as I realized what that meant. That the forward momentum my son had counted on had just stopped, abruptly, completely, and nothing scares people like him more than delays they can't control, because delays invite scrutiny. And scrutiny invites truth. As the men stepped away, leaving me alone again, the cell no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a waiting room, and I sat back slowly, pressing my palm flat against my chest to steady myself. My ring catching the light once more, and I couldn't help but let out a small, breathless laugh, ha, not because this was funny, but because of how absurd it all felt. That something my son dismissed as meaningless had just triggered a chain of events he would never see coming. I wiped my face and closed my eyes for a moment, grounding myself, because I knew this wasn't the end, it was the turning point. The quiet moment before consequences arrive, and somewhere outside these walls, my son was still celebrating, still confident, still unaware that the story he thought he controlled had slipped out of his hands entirely. And as footsteps echoed again, this time measured, synchronized, unmistakably purposeful, I opened my eyes with a calm I hadn't felt all day, knowing with absolute certainty that when the door finally opened, it wouldn't be for me to disappear, it would be for the truth to step fully into the light. The fall didn't happen where I was sitting, but I could feel it begin, like a distant tremor traveling through concrete and steel, and even before anyone spoke to me again, I knew my son's world was cracking in places he couldn't see. Sigh, because when systems move this quietly, this deliberately, they don't miss and they don't reverse, and somewhere beyond these walls, the confidence he wore like armor was already being stripped away piece by piece. I heard it first in the radios, voices tightening, phrases repeating, instructions confirmed twice instead of once, and then in the footsteps. No longer scattered or casual, but synchronized, purposeful, the kind you hear when decisions have been finalized. And I sat very still, hands folded, heart steady, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and resolve, because even now, even knowing what was unfolding, part of me still wished he would somehow wake up, somehow stop this before it went any further. A foolish hope, maybe. But mothers don't turn love off like a switch. Then the door across the corridor opened, and through the gap I caught fragments of raised voices, not shouting yet but confused, defensive. The tone people use when something isn't going according to plan, and I didn't need to hear names to know whose voice that was, because panic has a distinct sound when it belongs to someone who has never had to face consequences before. And I imagined him standing there, phone in hand, demanding explanations, laughing nervously at first, saying there must be some mistake, because people like him always believe mistakes only happen to other people minutes past. Or maybe seconds. Time felt unreliable again, but the shift was unmistakable, and when a guard finally approached my cell, his expression had changed completely, not cautious now, not curious, but professional, resolved. And he didn't look at me like a prisoner anymore, he looked at me like someone waiting for closure, and he said quietly, "They've been informed," and that was all he needed to say. Because information is a powerful thing when it reaches the wrong hands at the right moment. I pictured my son then, the smile finally slipping, the laughter drying up as reality caught up with him. The sudden realization that the story he told so confidently was being retold without him in control, and that image hurt more than it satisfied, because I didn't raise him to fall like this, I raised him to stand with integrity. And watching the consequences of his choices unfold felt like mourning someone who was still alive, weeping silently for the child he once was, not the man he had become. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping briefly outside my cell before moving on, and I understood then that this wasn't about spectacle or revenge. There would be no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation, just paperwork, procedures, and facts laid out with cold precision, because when authority corrects itself, it doesn't argue, it documents, and my son, who had relied on charm and confidence, would find those tools useless against records and verification. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes, letting the tension ease just slightly, because whatever happened next would no longer depend on my endurance or silence. And that alone felt like freedom, even here, even now, and I thought about the moment he laughed as I was taken away, how sure he was that this place would swallow me whole, and the irony of it all made my chest ache. Because he had mistaken patience for weakness, and humility for powerlessness. A sudden burst of activity erupted down the hall, voices overlapping now, urgent but controlled, and I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the truth had reached him fully, that the story he told himself was collapsing under the weight of facts he never prepared for, and I felt no triumph in that knowledge, only a quiet acceptance. Because consequences don't ask for your permission to arrive, they come when they're ready. I opened my eyes as the sound of handcuffs echoed faintly somewhere beyond my sight, the metallic click unmistakable, and my breath caught, not in satisfaction, but in finality, because that sound marks a turning point you can't undo, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it, the grief, the relief, the exhaustion, all tangled together. Sighed, this was never how I imagined my story with my son would unfold. As the noise faded and the corridor settled into a new kind of quiet, heavier than before, I rested my hands in my lap once more, the ring cool against my skin. And I understood something deeply then, something that would stay with me long after these walls were behind me. That power doesn't roar when it arrives, it corrects, it realigns, and it leaves people facing the consequences of their own choices. And somewhere tonight, my son was finally learning that lesson, even if it came far too late for both of us. By the time the door finally opened for me, it didn't feel like an escape or a victory. It felt like an ending, quiet and heavy, the kind that settles into your bones rather than lifting you off your feet. And as I stepped out, Guided calmly down the same corridor that had swallowed me earlier, I realized how much had changed without a single dramatic moment. Sigh, no shouting, no apologies, no explanations owed. Just the simple fact that the truth had been acknowledged, and that alone was enough to restore what had been taken from me. They didn't rush me, didn't treat me like someone fragile or guilty, just human, and that respect. Small as it may sound, almost broke me more than the cell ever did, because dignity is something you don't realize you've lost until it's quietly handed back. And as I walked, I thought of my son, not with anger anymore, but with a deep, aching sadness, because whatever consequences he was facing now, whatever doors had closed behind him, none of it could undo the moment he chose certainty over conscience. And that choice would follow him far longer than prison walls ever could outside. The air felt different, cooler, cleaner, and I stood there for a moment just breathing, grounding myself in the simple fact that I was still here, still standing. Still myself, and that realization carried more power than any apology or revenge ever could. Because survival, real survival, isn't about watching someone else fall. It's about refusing to disappear when they expect you to. I was told very little after that, and strangely, I didn't need to know more. I didn't need details or explanations. Because the system that had almost crushed me had corrected itself, and the same certainty my son once laughed with had been stripped from him just as quietly as it had been given, and as I touched the ring on my hand once more, I understood something that felt both painful and freeing, that the things which truly protect us are often invisible, unnoticed, dismissed by people who only believe in what they can take. I went home later, not to celebration. Not to relief, but to silence, and that silence felt honest, deserved, and as I sat there alone, I allowed myself to grieve properly, not just for what I lost, but for what I would never get back, the relationship I thought I had. The future I imagined, the version of my son I held onto for too long, weeping softly now without shame, because grief doesn't mean weakness, it means you cared deeply in a world that sometimes punishes care. And yet beneath that grief, there was something steadier, something unshaken, the knowledge that I had endured, that even when I was underestimated, dismissed, and locked away, I was never powerless, and neither are you, not really. Not when truth exists and time eventually forces it into the light. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you trusted too easily or a moment you were underestimated, then you already understand why stories like this matter, and why subscribing isn't about clicks, but about not forgetting that patience, dignity, and quiet strength still have power in a world that laughs too quickly.